You all again to the fifth part of this series of debates. Now for the ones that you just joined, I'm Marta Pérez de Albeniz, and with my colleague Capucine Legrand, we're acting as facilitators for this conversation. I would like to introduce you the participants that are joining now. Jessica, and that along with Mariana, work in Comunal from Mexico City, and Sophie Delhay from Paris.
And
Sophie.
welcome to EPFL.
And welcome to EPFL.
Thank you.
To both
Thank
of
you very much.
We know that you focus your work on housing and with a very special view on community. So we think that today's conversation is going to be a great opportunity to discuss about type.
Yeah, so the description of your practice sheds very clear light on the economy of means that characterize social housing for Sophie or the provision of shelter for Comunal. So a first question could be, is it the need to economize that has led you to focus your work on the most fundamental aspects of living and the most essential modes of agglomerating spatial units? And in other words, is this economical context of practice the true origin of your research on type, on archetype?
The origin of my practice or my research, and for my part, before being passionate about housing, I'm first and foremost passionate about the question of the place of the architect. How to take on this big responsibility, how far to go, how to leave place for the unknown, the unpredictable, the living, how not to formulate and predestine people's life, how not to be too much authoritarian, but rather permissive. So for me, housing in the end is a sort of excuse. It's the best way to approach these questions in a fundamental way because it touches everybody intimately. Of course, it's like in life, if it's only when your ideas are our types are confronted with reality, the context, with economical, technical, regulation constraints, that when everything goes well, this idea become refined and take flesh and sometimes are magnified. So that's exactly why I love architecture, because our ideas are tested against reality, and it's virtuous for both parties. For the ideas and for the reality, for the types and for the environment and the conditions. So where is the origin of my practice and the type or in the context? In France, we have an expression for this question, is what came first, the egg or the kitchen? I think a type without context is not yet architecture. Projects are the links I make between those two parts.
But Comunal, if you want to continue with this subject, or?
Yes, thanks. Well, I think that to economize, well, one of the origins of our practice is mainly due to try to approach to architecture, but from participatory processes. We have used a lot the tool of participatory architecture to understand another way of how can architects approach to communities, and also try to deconstruct many of the things that we learned in the university. We're trying to get together with the communities with another approach, and also two things mainly, to try to understand that inhabiting do not start from when the space is constructed, but inhabiting starts from designing and from also constructing your own space. So from that point of view, we think that to inhabit a space, it begins from the main primary participatory processes that we have with the communities, and that is a starting point that is very important for us. And also to try to understand our role, what is our role since the view of the community, and that the strategies should be designed and defined by the same people with which we are working with. And in that way, to economize part of the design processes are part of the decisions of the inhabitants, not our decisions. It's just a very small part of the whole strategies that we have to decide in conjunction with the inhabitants.
Given all these constraints that now we know you're facing every day with your projects, we wonder, how do you arrive at a material building from typology, and how do you validate it? Because do users' participation and appropriation play a role in it, or maybe the activities that take place programmatically in the dwelling?
For me, each project has its own constructive logic, which depends on the type of the project, but on the context and the economy of the project. So it's always a complex resolution, but for me, it's not a starting point. Well, not for the moment, anyway.
Well, in our case, we arrived to building a constructive system and to typology to the mainly result through a long social process in conjunction with the communities. We try to, as we explained in the presentation before, we try to have very specific social processes in conjunction with the community, so they can explain us their understanding of the place, all the problems that they have, and also the potentials that people have on the territory, so we can know which are the means on which we have to be, this collective knowledge has to be based on. So the starting point for us is to understand and also to make this collective research together with them, so we can design strategies, and all this social process will give place to the constructive system and to the typology by itself.
Okay. But you are working with community and therefore with institution in a way. The type of work you are involved with requires an almost structural relationship with institution. And so you have to open a dialogue with them to find common objectives. And as this relationship with institution affected the architecture of your work on one side, and on the other side, do you feel that your work has contributed to a shifting of objectives fixed by the institution? And if so, in which way? Or do you interact with institutions, with social landlords, for example? Or?
Yes, one cannot experiment without the permission of the client. So I look for ways to get off the beaten track of the discussions. But I do, in fact, so when I'm beginning an operation, I ask my client to manage some meetings with the constructors of their department and the managers. Normally in France you never meet the managers because they are not interested by the construction and the design of the building, but by the way the inhabitants live in the place. So for them it's two different questions, but for me it's the questions are totally linked. So I always ask them to work with all the departments, and it's very fun because In fact, managers had never assist to this phase of conception, so they are very interested. And in fact, they are the people who write the program. So you never meet them, but they write to you the things to do in the architecture. So we can dialogue, and sometimes it's tense, and sometimes it's very interesting. For example, in the project of Dijon, with the inhabited windows, the managers said that they didn't want so much big windows because they were afraid by the idea that the people put the chairs and the tables on the window, and that they will not live properly. So I was a bit expected by this, but in my mind I said, oh, it's a shame, because being there with your chair just in front of the windows is the best place to be, in fact. So we have to manage something to respond to these complex questions. So we've made this sort of depth window with the system that you can stay in this place. So we found our solution, and they were very happy to think differently the problems that they imagine. So sort of good dialogue sometimes.
Well, in our case, it has been a complete challenge to try to dialogue and also try to influence the public policies of our country, which are having, since many decades ago, a very important transformation in the territory, not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas, with these images that we showed before about the homogenization and the industrialization of the ways of living in the whole country, with just one type with just one typology and only one philosophy also of life. So one of our main axes is just to have this very close dialogue with the government and the different regulations on which they are based, the ways of being approached to social housing. So in these dialogues, the main thing that we have been talking about is how can public policies respect different ways of life that we have in our country, different cultures, different styles and living spaces that are need just to break these ideas of colonization and domination that we have very present, not just in Mexico, but also in Latin America. So this has been one of our main axes. A lot of our time is based in trying to influence the public policies of our country. Nowadays, we have a very close relationship with CONAVI, that is one of the institutions that decides how public policies in our country is going to be taken care. So we are trying to nowadays to have important reflections about good practices of not just of professionals, but also of government, of how to produce social housing in Mexico through participatory processes. So we are trying to design in conjunction with them a manual that can help to have a reflection, not just also in professionals and students, but also in the same inhabitants, in the same communities, to have a self-critical reflection about participatory architecture, and also try to break these ideas that natural materials or local materials are precarious. And that is one of the main objectives that we have, because that way of seeing architecture is changing the life of a lot of communities. So yes, for us, the relationship with the institutions, mainly government institutions, is one of our main axes.
As you just mentioned now that you work with the local materials, I was wondering, because you clearly, both of you, favor specific construction techniques and material choices. How much context dependent are they? And do you think they are going to change during the next years or during the next works you have in mind?
Well, we have to understand that we do not want to preserve, in a romantic vision, the ancestral ways of living and the vernacular housing, no? As a static way of seeing architecture. We want also to understand the different transformations also that in these communities that they have in different terms, in terms of economic, of culture, of politic aspects that are transforming the imaginaries also of their inhabitants. So we have to understand also this way of transforming the territories, but also through the view of how can the vision of autonomy can be respected in other communities that they want to preserve their ways of living, no? Or they want to maybe transform their ways of living, but not for them to represent domination or much more dependent aspects or relationships with government or with great enterprises. So it is a very difficult process where systemic thinking is very important and to approach these problems where we want to understand what kind of local materials or building or constructive systems people want to preserve and which are the potentials of those and which are the things that that is impossible to preserve because things are changing very rapidly. So the definition of what will be the result is also the understanding of the main transformations that nowadays are happening in these communities. So it's a very variable way of resulting in architecture.
Can I ask you one question that tries to bring together two of the things that you said at the beginning? I was very impressed by the rectangle with the 6 squares that you use to reorganize the space of the dwelling. Then I also look at La Vivienda, the first and the second, that you produced, and the way in which you use building materials, in my perception from here, would actually make it a challenge to actually adapt those materials to the variations in the squares. How do you actually bring together the typology with the 6 squares and your material choices and your material palette? I don't know if I've been clear.
It's a question for both, or?
No, first it's a question for Comunal, because I think it applies to you in a slightly different way. So I was curious to hear from them first, and then change it, in a sense, to the context of Paris.
Well, in our case, we try to make a very important conjunction between, in some cases when it is required, which are the potentials of the industrial materials versus the potentials of the local materials. So we try to understand which are the different ways on which they can dialogue in terms of a view of a systemic strategy that tries to enhance collective knowledge, collective work between people, and also try to understand which are the different possibilities that we can have in the solutions. So for us, the multiplicity and of the alternatives for living spaces, and to put that into the table and to try to design all these multiplicity of spaces in a participatory process is very important. But I don't know if I am answering your question, Paulo. Sorry.
Let me see if I can try and explain myself a bit differently. It seems to me that the two examples, the two prototypes, residential prototypes that you have, are extremely sophisticated in the way in which you put materials together, but in such a way that they are no longer typical. In a sense, they become very, very specific, because their facades, for instance, their elevation change depending on which side of the street, of the road, the house faces. So in a sense, that is the opposite of a typological process, because a typological process cannot become not picturesque, but specific to a particular place. And that's why I think it's interesting to understand how you know, if you integrate these two processes, particularly when introducing as well the participatory variable that makes things even more difficult to manage.
Okay, I think that in this sense, we can explain that the physical result of the typology is a result of the participatory process, of the different uses that the inhabitants explain they want to have in the space. So it is like in the opposite way, no? The participatory process helps us to define the type of uses that the people want to have, and in that way, the physical appearance of the space represents all those participatory processes, all those social processes. So it is the result of the social process, and it is not in the other way around. So the use of the spaces define the physical result of these typologies, and it is not just about the space, and it is, as you are saying, also like the material definition of each one of the parts that is also designed by the people with which we collaborate. Many people, a lot of time they ask us, but people really design these spaces? You are the ones who design these spaces, right? But no, with these participatory processes, it's just the other way around. So like the architecture is just the excuse for how to approach with these people under a collaborative exposure of ideas. So it is the other way around. Participatory processes define the typology.
Okay, so I will try to follow up by moving from Chiapas or Mexico to Paris. Because, Sophie, you've actually shown a series of buildings that have been reduced to geometric forms, to geometric shapes. Now, depending on which building we're looking at, the modules that you have selected change in shape. You've been using squares, you've been using rectangles, you've been using elongated shapes. Given that the programs are almost always the same, you said that yourself, what determines the typological direction?
I think that it's a meeting of a lot of questions, urban ones and geometric ones, and surfaces and norms. And you know, for each project at the beginning, we've got a sort of question that at the moment all of them meet in something very simple, that is the room, the square room for this one, and the system with the walls to cap the panorama, or a system of post and beam to be very fluently. So it's never for one reason. It's always for the combination of a lot of questions. But it's funny, but one day we said, we've got the key. The key can answer to this urban question. For example, in the program, we've got very little houses, we've got a very big building. So with this unit, we can resolve urban problems, and we could resolve problems of division of the surfaces that always change between the different clients. On type 3, it changes, so the room changes. So it's a sort of resolution très tard when we got all the questions, and it's a solution.
Thank you very much. Can you tell us what importance do you give to ornament? What is the role of ornament in your work of decoration?
I tried to escape this question with my little hands. The little hands is, the hands on the
stencil.
It's a sort of answer that I make.
Okay.
In our case, ornament is one of the last things that we approach with the people with which we work, because the efficiency of the use of materials, of the workforce, of the economy is much more important than ornament. And ornament will come afterwards when people have the possibilities and also the intentions and to make it happen. But also, like, ornament maybe in our imaginary will be very different if I ask many of the families with which we have worked with, what is ornament for them than for us. So for them, maybe it will be the altar of the religious space that they will put inside with their traditional roses and materials. So ornament for them, I would think it will signify or be much more approach to their philosophy of life and to their ways of living that is more related to tradition or to the spirituality of how to inhabit a space more than in a aesthetic way of view.
So why do you actually cut bamboo in 4 different directions?
That was a design that the community want to explore. Also in the productive rural school, the girls designed different panels with different exchange of the bamboo of different el entramado. So they designed different ways of take care of the bamboo for a specific material that will be a window, for example. So they explore different ways of using materials. So it's also a part of an exploration also.
And
I'm done.
And Sophie, in the same way, you talk about the project in Lille with the yellow paint on the common spaces, but in a way it's also a form of ornamentation, because of the materials that are below, and all the materials are different, so you explained that you have to put like a parking paint to unify the space, but it's also...
And
but it's a cheap way of bringing ornamentation in the space.
Yes, because I don't have the money for the projects for ornamentations, but I always find a place for it on the project. For example, the yellow is a sort of ornament, like a frieze on a beam, or it can be something offer like that. But in fact, I think it's a question of design that I like to contourner. Because I want to give the power to inhabitants and not in the design of the architect. So that's why for some details, like the way you do with the concrete when it's not good, I worked with the workers to invent together something. But it's sort of ornamentation, but without a sign of architect.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your words. I'm afraid we just run out of time. And,
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you again for joining today in this event.
And hope to see you in live sometimes.
Yes.
Hopefully.
Yes. Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you
Thank
very
you very
much.
much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.